A billionaire fakes bankruptcy to test his wife's loyalty, and the result leaves him stunned. Before we begin, share where you're watching from in the comments below. Ethan, a 45-year-old billionaire, seemed to have it all: a thriving business, a luxurious lifestyle, and a stunning young wife, Sophie. At just 24, Sophie had captured his heart, but not everyone was convinced their love was real. Rumors swirled around their marriage, calling her a gold digger. Stories of her past relationships and questionable motives reached Ethan's ears. Sophie's extravagant shopping habits, lack of interest in work, and obsession with luxury only fueled his doubts. Friends and family whispered, "She's just in it for the money." Ethan tried to brush it off at first, but as he watched her spend her days hopping from one designer store to another, the doubts grew stronger. What if the rumors were true? What if Sophie loved his wealth more than she loved him? These thoughts consumed Ethan, especially as he thought about starting a family. He wanted children, but not if their mother didn't truly care for him. Could Sophie handle a life without luxury? Would she stand by him if things got tough? Ethan had to know the truth. So, he came up with a bold plan. He would fake bankruptcy. No mansion, no cars, no private jets. Just a simple, stripped-down life. Would Sophie stay by his side or leave him for someone wealthier? It was a risky gamble, but for Ethan, it was the only way to uncover the truth. One evening, Ethan came home later than usual, his face heavy with an unfamiliar weariness. He walked into the living room, where Sophie sat scrolling through her phone, a glass of wine in hand. She barely glanced up as he set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice tense. Sophie finally looked at him, sensing something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, setting her phone aside. Ethan sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "We've lost everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The business is gone. The house, the cars, everything. We're penniless." For a moment, Sophie just stared at him. "What are you talking about?" she said, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "You're joking, right?" "I wish I were," Ethan replied, shaking his head. A series of bad deals, market crashes, it all fell apart. "We'll have to leave the house by the end of the week." Sophie blinked, her mind racing. "Leave the house? Ethan, this is our home. What about the cars? The staff? My credit cards?" "It's all gone, Sophie. We have nothing left." The room fell silent. For the first time in her life, Sophie felt completely powerless. She stared at Ethan, waiting for him to tell her it was all a cruel joke. But his expression didn't change. When the truth finally sank in, Sophie froze. She was stunned, scared, and unsure of what to say. But then, as though grasping for hope, she forced a small smile. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice trembling. I'll support you. We'll get through it together." Her words sounded promising, but neither of them knew how difficult the road ahead would be. The following week, they left their mansion and moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Sophie had never lived in such cramped conditions. The absence of housekeepers and luxury was jarring, and the responsibilities she had always taken for granted now fell squarely on her shoulders. The first morning in their new home, Sophie attempted to cook breakfast. She burned the toast, undercooked the eggs, and somehow managed to set off the smoke alarm. Ethan came rushing into the kitchen to find her fanning the smoke with a dish towel, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "I don't know how to do this, Ethan," she cried. "I've never had to do any of this before." Ethan sighed, torn between sympathy and exhaustion. "You'll figure it out," he said gently. "We both will." But it wasn't just the cooking. Sophie struggled with cleaning, doing laundry, and even grocery shopping. She had no idea how to budget, often buying unnecessary items and forgetting the essentials. Each mistake led to arguments, some small, others explosive. "You can't just buy candles and flowers when we barely have enough for groceries," Ethan snapped one evening. "Well, excuse me for trying to make this place feel less miserable," Sophie shot back. As if the challenges of their new life weren't enough, Sophie's past came back to haunt her. News of Ethan's bankruptcy spread quickly through their social circles. Former boyfriends, smelling blood in the water, began to resurface. "Hey, Sophie," one of them texted. "I heard about Ethan. Tough break. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Another sent her flowers with a note. "You deserve better. Call me." At first, Sophie ignored them, too embarrassed to respond. But as the days went by and the reality of her new life weighed on her, the temptation began to creep in. One of her exes, a wealthy businessman named Marcus, took it a step further. He showed up at her favorite cafe, where she had gone to escape the suffocating apartment for a while. "Sophie," he said with a charming smile, "I heard about what happened. It's awful. You shouldn't have to live like this." "I'm fine, Marcus," Sophie replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Fine," Marcus said, raising an eyebrow. "Come on, Sophie. You're better than this. A woman like you shouldn't be stuck in some tiny apartment, struggling to make ends meet. Let me help you." Sophie hesitated, the offer hanging in the air. Part of her wanted to say yes, to escape the chaos and discomfort of her new life. But another part of her, a quieter but growing voice, whispered that running away wouldn't solve anything. The stress of their situation began to take a toll on Ethan as well. He spent long hours searching for work, trying to find a way to rebuild their life. The weight of their new reality left him irritable and distant, and Sophie often felt like she was fighting their battles alone. One evening, after yet another argument, Sophie sat in their tiny living room, staring at the text messages from her exes. She thought about the life she could have if she walked away, an easy life filled with comfort and luxury. But then she looked around the room. It wasn't much, but it was hers and Ethan's. And despite everything, she remembered why she had married him in the first place. Beneath the stress and the arguments, she still loved him. "I can't keep running," she whispered to herself. The next day, Sophie made a decision. She would stop waiting for things to get better and start doing something about it. For the first time in her life, she would fight for what she had. Sophie sat on their small couch, scrolling through job listings on her phone. She had no experience and no skills, making every job feel out of reach. But she was determined to do something. Life without money was harder than she imagined, and she couldn't keep relying on Ethan. While she was deep in thought, her friend Valerie showed up at the door. Valerie, dressed in designer clothes, walked in and looked around the tiny apartment with a mix of shock and pity. "Sophie," Valerie said, "what are you doing here? This isn't the life for you." Sophie didn't respond, so Valerie kept going. "I mean, Ethan has nothing left. Why are you still here? Marcus has been asking about you. You know he's still rich, right? You could have everything you want again." Sophie's heart sank. For a moment, she thought about how easy it would be to say yes. But she shook the thought away. "I'm staying with my husband," she said. Valerie smirked. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you when you're still living like this in a year." The pressure didn't stop there. Sophie's parents also called, urging her to leave Ethan. They reminded her of Marcus, saying he would take care of her and give her the life she deserved. But Sophie pushed back. "I'm not leaving Ethan," she said again and again. Even though part of her was scared, another part wanted to prove she could stand by him, no matter how hard things got. Ethan, meanwhile, was watching Sophie closely. He had expected her to leave within weeks, but she hadn't. Instead, she was trying. She burned dinner, made a mess cleaning, and didn't know how to budget, but she kept going. One day, he came home to find her folding laundry, something she had never done before. "Dinner's almost ready," she said when she saw him. "It's not much, but it's something." Ethan was amazed. He had doubted her loyalty for months, but Sophie was proving him wrong in ways he hadn't expected. Still, part of him wondered if it was real. Was she truly changing, or was this just temporary? One day, Ethan was invited to a meeting at an old friend's house. It was meant to be a simple business discussion, but as he stepped inside, his world shifted. In the kitchen, wearing an apron and scrubbing dishes, was Sophie. Ethan froze. His wife, who once spent her days surrounded by designer clothes and luxury, was now working as a maid. He couldn't process it. Embarrassment hit him like a wave. He had doubted her, questioned her loyalty, and wondered if she'd leave him when life got tough. And yet, here she was, working quietly in someone else's home, doing what she could to support them. He excused himself from the meeting as quickly as he could, his thoughts racing. That evening, when he returned home, he found Sophie waiting for him with a small package in her hands. "I got you something," she said softly, handing it to him. Ethan opened the package to find a shirt, not expensive, but simple and neatly folded. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "I noticed you sold some of your clothes," Sophie said. "I know it's not much, but I thought you might need it." Ethan's mind reeled. He had sold his belongings, including most of his wardrobe, to keep his struggling company alive. Sophie knew this, and instead of complaining or blaming him, she had gone out of her way to buy him something. The weight of everything hit him all at once. Ethan excused himself, heading straight for the bathroom. Inside, he gripped the sink, staring at his reflection. His chest felt heavy, his vision blurred with tears. The guilt, the doubt, the realization of what Sophie had done. It was too much. For months, he had been testing her, waiting for her to fail, convinced she would leave when life got hard. But Sophie had proven him wrong at every turn. She hadn't just stayed. She had worked, sacrificed, and supported him in ways he never expected. In that moment, Ethan knew he had been wrong. Sophie's love wasn't tied to his wealth or status. It was real, and it was stronger than anything he had imagined. When he finally stepped out of the bathroom, his doubts were gone. He looked at Sophie with a new sense of gratitude and love. Eventually, the weight of his lies became too much for Ethan to carry. The guilt pressed down on him, invading his thoughts, his sleep, and his every interaction with Sophie. Day after day, he watched her, amazed at how much she had changed. She wasn't the same woman who once spent her days in boutiques and salons. This Sophie was strong, determined, and selfless in ways he never imagined. But the guilt wouldn't let him celebrate her growth. He knew it was all built on a lie he had carefully crafted to test her love. Ethan had started the deception with one goal: to protect himself from a life of uncertainty and doubt. But now, he was trapped in the very lie he had created. The stress began to take a toll. Ethan grew distant, his mind consumed by the secret he kept. He struggled to focus, often losing track of conversations or tasks. He barely ate, and at night, he would sit in the dark, questioning himself over and over. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself in the stillness. Sophie noticed his behavior, but she didn't press him. She assumed he was overwhelmed by their financial struggles, unaware of the true cause of his turmoil. She tried to help in small ways, offering kind words, cooking meals, and reminding him that they were in this together. Her gestures only deepened Ethan's guilt. One day, after hours of pacing the small apartment, Ethan decided he couldn't keep it inside any longer. The truth was eating him alive, and he knew Sophie deserved to know. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Ethan mustered the courage to speak. His voice trembled as he began. "Sophie, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his hands clenched tightly. She looked up from the book she was reading, her expression curious but calm. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt like the walls were closing in on him, but he forced himself to continue. "The bankruptcy. It wasn't real." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sophie's face shifted from confusion to disbelief as she stared at him, waiting for an explanation. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice cracking. "I made it all up. The business is fine. The money is still there. I needed to know if you loved me or for the life I gave you. So I faked losing everything to see if you would stay." Sophie didn't say a word. She sat frozen, her eyes locked on him as his confession sank in. Her breathing quickened, and her hands clenched into fists. Ethan felt the tension building in the room, but he couldn't stop now. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he continued, his voice desperate. "I was scared, Sophie. I didn't know if I could trust you, and I needed to be sure before we built a life together." Sophie's silence broke as she stood abruptly, her movements sharp and deliberate. Her face was a mixture of anger and pain. She grabbed her coat and moved toward the door without a word. Ethan panicked. "Sophie, please," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't go. Let me explain." She cut him off with a sharp glance, her eyes full of fury. I need space, she said coldly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Then, without another word, she walked out, the door slamming shut behind her. Ethan stood alone in the silence, his heart sinking. He had feared this moment for months, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of it. Sophie was gone, and for the first time, he truly understood the gravity of his actions. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Would she come back? Could she ever forgive him? Or had he destroyed the very thing he was trying to protect? That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He replayed every moment of their marriage, from the day they met to the moment she walked out the door. He thought about her laughter, her determination, and the love she had shown him, even when he didn't deserve it. The truth was clear. Ethan had doubted Sophie, but it was his own insecurities that had driven him to this point. He had been so focused on testing her love that he had never stopped to ask if he was worthy of hers. And now, he wasn't sure if he'd ever get the chance to make things right. After storming out of the apartment, Sophie found herself wandering aimlessly through the streets. Her heart was heavy with anger, betrayal, and confusion. She had given everything she could to support Ethan during their supposed struggles, and now she felt like it had all been a cruel game. Her steps led her to a quiet Ethiopian Orthodox church, a place she had often passed but never entered. That day, something urged her to step inside. The church was serene, bathed in the soft glow of candles. The scent of frankincense filled the air, and the faint sound of prayers echoed in the distance. Sophie sat on one of the wooden benches, her mind racing as she looked up at the paintings of saints and angels. For the first time in weeks, she let herself cry, not just from anger, but from exhaustion and confusion. God, she whispered, what am I supposed to do? I've tried so hard to change, to be better. But was it all for nothing? She spent hours there, pouring out her thoughts and reflecting on everything. She thought about the woman she used to be, the materialistic, self-absorbed Sophie who cared only for appearances. She thought about the woman she had become, stronger, more resilient, and willing to fight for her marriage. I'm not perfect, she admitted quietly, but I've come so far. Please, guide me. Show me what to do. Over the next few days, Sophie stayed away from home, using the time to reflect. The anger she felt toward Ethan began to shift. While she couldn't excuse his deception, she started to understand why he had done it. He had been scared, just like she was. She felt embarrassed by the woman she had been before. Shallow, focused on wealth, and blind to the deeper things in life. But she also felt proud of how far she had come. She had faced challenges she never thought she could handle, and she had grown into someone she barely recognized. One morning, as Sophie prepared to return to the church, she noticed unusual symptoms: nausea, fatigue, and a missed cycle. A part of her dismissed it as stress, but something told her to take a pregnancy test. Her heart raced as she waited for the result. When the test confirmed it, tears filled her eyes. She was pregnant. For Sophie, this was a sign. She believed it was God's way of reminding her of the commitment she had made to her marriage, to Ethan, and to herself. That evening, Sophie returned to the apartment. Ethan looked up as the door opened, his face filled with relief and fear. He stood, unsure of what to say, but Sophie spoke first. I needed time, she said, her voice calm but firm. I was hurt, Ethan, angry, but I've realized something. I've changed. And I don't want to throw away everything we've built because of one mistake. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. Sophie, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I was wrong to doubt you. I didn't trust you, and I didn't deserve the love you gave me. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I love you. I always have. Sophie took his hand, her own eyes shining with emotion. I'm still angry, Ethan, she admitted, but I love you too. And I want our child to grow up knowing that love is stronger than mistakes. Ethan froze, his eyes widening. Child? Sophie nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. We're going to be parents, Ethan, and I want our child to grow up in a home filled with love, not doubt or fear. Ethan pulled her into a tight embrace, his emotions overwhelming him. I'll never doubt you again, he promised. and I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was real. Together, Sophie and Ethan rebuilt their marriage, not on wealth or appearances, but on trust, love, and faith. For Sophie, the pregnancy wasn't just a sign of a new life. It was a reminder that she had the strength to create something beautiful, even from the hardest challenges. And for Ethan, it was proof that love, once tested, could grow even stronger.